So what we're going to be looking at in this lesson is we're going to be looking at a lot of the government institutions that exist through all of the different countries that we're really going to be studying throughout the semester. So the first thing that we're going to look at here are executives. In many countries, the executive is split into two different roles. You've got the head of state and the head of government. The head of state is really just a ceremonial role in most places, if it is a separate role from the head of government. And what the head of state does is it symbolizes and represents the people, both nationally and internationally. So when you look at England, for example, when the Queen of England is the head of state, it's a ceremonial role, it's a figurehead concept, she does ceremonial things, she meets with other leaders of other countries and things like that, but when you look at her power within the government, there really is none. She doesn't really have the say to stop the passage of legislation, to spur on the passage of legislation. So they're really just kind of there. You also have the head of government, and the head of government deals with everyday tasks of running the state and usually directs the activities of other members of the executive branch. And if there is no executive branch, like say once again with the United Kingdom, where the Prime Minister is really just the head of the majority party and there are no separation of powers and things like that, then they're just going to run the people within their party. In the United States, when we look at the concept of head of state and head of government, those are merged concepts. The President of the United States plays both of those roles. So it's in just certain places where we're going to see that separated, and in certain places we're going to see that being the exact same thing. So what does the chief executive actually do? The chief executive is responsible for the policy-making process, implementing new policies, and playing an important role in their adoption. And we're going to see this vary throughout different countries as to the role of the chief executive actually in the policy making, but most of the time they're going to play some important role in the policy making process. The executive, like we said, is responsible for the implementation of new policy. Executives are supposed to execute the law. That is the whole purpose of why they exist. And then making sure that they're adopted. So chief executives, especially if it's in a democracy, they're going to go through and they're going to make lots of speeches to try and get people on board and trying to get people to buy in to the things that they want to see implemented within the country. All right. They also hold other members of the executive responsible for their actions. So people in the bureaucracy, other high-ranking officials, they're going to make sure that those people are doing the jobs they're supposed to be doing. So the cabinet. In parliamentary systems, the cabinet is the most important decision-making body. What they do is they're responsible for going out, and we're going to talk about this in more detail when we talk about the UK, but they're responsible for going out and meeting with people who work within the bureaucracy, who actually execute the jobs and execute the policy. And it's their job to go up there and talk to those people to see the types of things that they need so that legislation can be crafted, and then they take that back to the Prime Minister, who then pushes these things through the Parliament. So the ministers are leaders of the majority party of Parliament or of the coalition government, because right now in the United Kingdom there is no majority party, which is what you would normally see. No one of the three parties within the United Kingdom were able to gain a majority in the Parliament, so they had to form a government with another party within the system in order to be able to get the majority that you need. And we'll talk about that in a lot more detail later on. But that coalition government is just when you have two parties come together in order to be able to form a majority. When we look at presidential systems and we look at the cabinet is really just used to advise the president. They've got certain roles and jobs that they do, but really the big thing that the cabinet is supposed to do is they're supposed to advise them. And really when we look at how that cabinet works is they're going to be made up of people from different parties, different genders, different races, different geographical regions in order to try and make the entire country feel involved in the system. Also within the executive, we have what is known as the bureaucracy, and most of the time the bureaucracy is going to be attached to that executive branch. Bureaucratic agencies are those who actually implement government policy. So you've got the executive who's supposed to execute those laws to make sure that they're done, and the bureaucracy is the agencies that are the ones that are responsible for actually implementing those things. Bureaucracies have increased over the last century as a way to specialize in tasks. So what are the characteristics of a bureaucracy, and looking at how they work? Bureaucracies have several basic characteristics. They are hierarchical in authority. So that means it's a top-down structure. If we were to look at a pyramid is a great way to explain what a hierarchical authority is. There's very few people at the top that are making the decisions, and then those decisions trickle down the different levels in order to make sure that the people at the bottom are doing their job. To get a job in the bureaucracy, it's a non-elected position. In order to get a job in most bureaucracies, you have to take some sort of civil service test in order to be able to qualify for that job. And then it's going to tell you the type of job that you're good at and where you should be working at. Then there are formal qualifications for jobs, whether that be experience, whether that be education level or testing and things like that. All of those things are going to be very structured as far as how you qualify for a job and how you get promotions and things like that. Then you've got task specialization. You do your job, you always do your job, you never do somebody else's job, and if that person needs to talk to somebody else to get that thing done, then they need to go talk to the other people. And that's why a lot of times in bureaucracies, why they're really talked down upon, is because you get transferred and transferred and transferred and transferred and transferred, and it seems like people can't help you with your job, but that's only because these people that work within these jobs are supposed to do one thing and one thing only. There are extensive rules, and you follow those rules no matter what. You don't care if the person walks in, if they're a single mother with 2 kids and they need to be able to get this, that, and the other done. These are the rules, and this is how we're going to follow the rules, and this is what my job is, so this is what you have to deal with. There are clear goals within the bureaucracy. This is the policy that we need to implement, and these are the things that we need to do in order to do that. It's also based upon the merit principle. And when we look at the idea of the merit principle, is that you get a promotion in your job because you're good at your job, because you do the things that you're supposed to do, because you test well and things like that. When you look within bureaucracies, the idea is that you don't get a promotion just because you know somebody or that you kiss somebody's butt above you. Impersonality, and that kind of goes back to the extensive rules concept of you don't care who you're talking to. It could be your own mother, and if they don't follow the rules and they don't meet the requirements, then there's nothing you can do for them. And they're also known for that red tape and inefficiency. And it's that impersonality and those extensive rules why a lot of people don't like bureaucracies. Alright, so look at the concept of democracy versus authoritarian. In a democracy, bureaucracies have some discretionary power. This is the ability to make small decisions in implementing legislative and executive decisions. So they realize that maybe there's a little bit of a gray area and there's a better way to do it. They have the ability to kind of work within that gray area to get the things done that they need to get done. Alright, this allows the bureaucracy in a democracy to have significant policy-making influence. A lot of times bureaucracies have the power to determine whether or not they're actually going to force people to fit in certain boxes to be able to do certain things. Now, that type of policy-making discretion does not exist within an authoritarian regime. Bureaucracies are strictly controlled in authoritarian regimes by the executive. They have no discretionary power, and if you try and execute discretionary power, then you may be executed. It's kind of how that goes within an authoritarian regime. Alright, so when we look at legislative branches, so the bureaucracy kind of fits into that executive model. Alright, they're generally attached to the executive. So if we're going to look at it, we've got a separate concept of legislature. Alright, the legislative branch of government is responsible for making laws for their country. Legislatures may be bicameral, 2 houses, or unicameral, which is 1 house. We look at the United States, there's bicameral. When we look at Russia, there's bicameral. Mexico is going to have a bicameral system. So there's a lot of times you're going to see that. When we look at unicameral, that means 1 house, and we're going to look at some systems like that. But bicameral legislatures generally exist to allow 1 house to represent regional governments. So that would be like in the United States, where you've got the Senate, where the Senate, you've got 2 senators from each state. So that is definitely that regional concept. And then you've got 1 house that's used to represent the people. and that's our House of Representatives. And that's going to hold true when we look at these other countries that have bicameral legislatures. Alright, so what are the functions of the legislator? What are they responsible for doing? Well, one of the main things that they're responsible is the idea of elite recruitment. That it's their responsibility to go out and find the best people that are out there to be able to then encourage them to run for office. Elite recruitment is going to work very differently within China and Russia because of their communist background. So really what they're doing is, rather than encouraging them to run, they're just bringing them into the fold and making sure that they're part of that governmental system. Legislatures are responsible for policy making, so it's actually their responsibility to craft and create the law. They're responsible for the budgeting of money, which is also known as appropriation. They're responsible for raising money, which is also known as raising revenue. And most of the time they're responsible for appointing important officials in the executive and judicial branch. That's going to be very different in the United States. When we look at that later on, and you study that in American government, but within the American system, the legislature doesn't necessarily appoint anybody in the executive or the judicial. They are just responsible for accepting those appointments. And then we've got the judiciary. What is the judiciary's role? The judiciary's role varies wildly between different countries. Courts in authoritarian systems have little to no independence. When we look at China, the court system is stacked, and most of the time if you're accused of a crime, you're going to be found guilty. So there's very little impartiality in there. Some have constitutional courts that determine the constitutionality of government decisions and have great independence. So there's a wide variety that we're going to see. Determining constitutionality of a law is known as judicial review. So we're going to look at places where there is judicial review, and we're going to look at places where there's not judicial review. And you'll be surprised that when we talk about that there are even some democratic places that don't have judicial review, and we'll kind of talk about how that happens.